Welcome to the 10,000 subscriber count Q&A video. Thank you to all my viewers for getting us here, and let's begin. BD648 from Patreon asks, do you have a pet card or otherwise a favorite card that might not be the most powerful? Heliod Sun Crowned. I like how it's a combo, but it's a little bit more difficult to put together than other combos. Zyler from Patreon asks, what is your favorite deck archetype, and can you give some example decks of that archetype you like for the different formats? I wouldn't say that I like any specific deck archetype the most, though I do tend to stay away from aggro and linear combo decks. I'll play a lot of different things, but currently I play Elementals in Modern and Mono Green Devotion in Pioneer. Legacy I'm kind of all over the place and don't have one fixed deck. And for EDH, I tend to play multicolor sort of mid-range value fests like Kenrith the Returned King. Zyler also asks, have you considered playing other TCGs? If so, which one and why? I have not considered playing any other TCGs. Magic eats up my time. Zyler also asks, do you have any favorite non-TCG board games? I'm not really much of a board game person, although I have played and had fun with them. Unknowable Entity of Darkness from Patreon asks, what are the main decks you play / have played in Pioneer, Modern, Legacy, and potentially Commander, Vintage, Pauper, Standard? Currently my only fixed decks are Mono Green Devotion in Pioneer and Elementals in Modern, but I've bounced around all over the place and played all kinds of different decks in those formats, although I've never played Vintage, and I did play Pauper, but only for a short time, and it was a long time ago. Some other favorite decks of mine have been various flavors of Urza and Heliod Sun Crown decks in Modern. Philip Nguyen from Patreon asks, what content are you excited to try on your YouTube channel in the future? I'd like to get gameplay on the channel from something like Moto, and if I can ever get the camera equipment and all sorts of other equipment that I need, plus a lot of people together, I would like to do more IRL content. Philip Nguyen also asks, how do you handle negative feedback or trolls? I actually feel that I've been pretty lucky in this regard in that most of the feedback that I've gotten has been positive, and I haven't really seen many people trolling as far as I can tell. As far as trolls or people who are just coming on to do things like name calling, you have to just ignore that kind of stuff. Now, negative feedback, it can be useful or not useful. So if someone just comes on and says something like, I hate you, you suck, there's nothing you can really do with that. But I have gotten feedback for things like how to improve the audio quality. Some people say I speak too quickly, that I'm too monotone. I used to use sidechain compression for incorporating the music into the videos, and a few people brought up that that was not a good choice, and they were absolutely correct, so I've gone to manually adjusting the audio levels. Basically, negative feedback isn't bad if you can do something with it. In fact, negative feedback is the most important feedback you can get as far as improving goes. Cameron Barton from Patreon asks, what was your first constructed deck and what format was it? The very first official constructed deck I played was in Standard, and it was a ramp summoning trap deck that used overgrown battlements as well as other ramp cards to get to summoning trap and other payoffs as fast as possible to potentially put things like Primeval Titan and Emrakul into play. In fact, one of my earliest Magic memories from a competitive tournament was an opponent mono-leaking my overgrown battlement on turn 2 and then summoning trapping in Emrakul in response to that. Bandit Z Raver asks, what is your preferred cards to deal with things that Blood Moon answers if you got your desires to either write out Blood Moon or errata it? I think effects that either tax your mana without outright getting rid of it, cards like Archon of Emeria for example are good, or Alpine Moon if you need to answer one specific thing. Also cards that are one-off effects, like although I think Price of Progress is probably too good for Modern, that sort of effect would probably be better than Blood Moon. Draken Garfinkel 3133 asks, what plane do you want to see revisited in an upcoming set? I think Ixalan was actually a pretty good set in terms of the flavor and world building, and it had the best MTG story that I'd read on the website. The problem with the set was, of course, that it followed in the footsteps of other sets like Dragon's Maze and the original Kamigawa, where it was just far too underpowered to really be that interesting. So with the Lost Caverns of Ixalan being a reintroduction to the set that's coming up this year, I think that could be a pretty nice revisit to the plane if they get the power level correct. They also ask, favorite formats ranked. From best to worst, Booster Draft, EDH, CEDH, Cube Draft, Legacy, Modern, Judge Tower, Pioneer, Standard, Sealed, and then I don't play any of the other formats. Bob8Z asks, how about make some Standard and MTG Arena content? I'm neither a fan of Standard nor MTG Arena, although I did play both of them in the past. Standard is too difficult and expensive to keep up with, as is MTG Arena, especially in comparison to Moto. And I can't really put my finger on why, but I get really frustrated playing Arena, whereas I don't have the same feeling when I play Moto. I think Arena's economy and how the game systems and mechanics are built are also far more predatory. Fresh Prince of Bel-Air 17 asks, I want your take on my blue-white deck and how you feel about the positioning of blue-white control in Pioneer. Well, as far as blue-white control in Pioneer goes, I think it's a perfectly fine, serviceable deck, just like many other decks in the format. As far as your specific build of the deck goes, there's a lot of main deck inclusions that I'm not a fan of here, like Brimaw's main, Karn the Great Creator I don't think is very good in this deck, Regal Caracal main, and I don't think you can really afford to stretch your mana base so far as in order to play Leyline Binding the same way you can in the other multicolor decks. And I notice also that you've had to cut some counter spells like Drawry Disruption, for example, or Cheap or Removal in order to accommodate all of this. I think you should play a more traditional blue-white control deck if you're going to play one in Pioneer. Matteo Consiglio 6695 asks, what do you think about unbanning most of the modern ban list? Well, alright then, let's bring up the modern ban list. Let's see. Ancient Dead, Birthing Paw, Dark Depths, Great Furnace, Green Sun, One Spawn Time. Nope, none of those are safe to come off. Ryan Malinowski 7529 asks, what was the Magic set or block that you started playing? I started playing officially at local game stores in April 2010, which was Rise of the Eldrazi. I technically played earlier than that in that I had some cards that I got from a friend and picked up occasionally, but that was more just casual whenever I saw them come over. Ryan Malinowski also asks, what is your favorite and least favorite formats and suggestions to fix said formats? Well, that's a lot. I really like Booster Draft, but the problem is that Booster Drafts have become really bad EV over the years, especially with the introduction of collector boosters bifurcating the prices along with Mythic Rarity. So in order for Booster Drafts to be worth it in a sense, there would need to be actually good, worthwhile rares financially speaking in order for you to risk paying the money in order to draft in the first place. EDH is mostly fine, although I don't like the inclusion of the fast mana cards, specifically Sol Ring, Mana Crypt, and Mana Vault, but I doubt any of those will ever get banned. Pioneer is pretty awful, as I've said in previous videos. I think it needs much better answers printed into the format. I would specifically point out cards like Path to Exile, Lightning Bolt, and Mana Leak. It doesn't have to specifically be those three exact cards, but it just needs much better answers than what it has. Also, probably there needs to be some bannings. I would at least hit Parhelion 2, Treasure Cruise, and Dig Through Time. The Delve spells aren't problems right now, and they mostly see play in Izzet Phoenix, which isn't doing that great anyway, but they will eventually be problems. Modern's been completely upended because of the One Ring, and that's for sure going to get banned at some point, likely in the next 3 months, probably 3 weeks after the next Modern Pro Tour. It has a lot of other problems though, and it's too big of a topic to get into right now. Ryan also asks, if you were to make a dual deck product, what would you make and what would it be called? I would make Phyrexia versus the Eldrazi, Ultimate Villains All-Out Attack. Marcelo de Carvalho 6030 asks, do you hate EDH? I do not hate EDH, in fact I like EDH. In fact, I used to own 12 EDH decks simultaneously, although I haven't played the format in a while. Anton Genselin 1809 asks, what is the worst deck to play in every format? Pioneer Boggles, Modern Neobrand, Legacy 4 Horsemen, and EDH Grand Arbiter Augustin IV. Light Pink asks, do you think a competitive format will ever be the most popular? No, because casual and EDH players greatly outnumber competitive players. You're going to get a lot more players playing EDH at local game stores or in just local play groups, and people just playing casually at their kitchen table, far more so than you're going to have tournament players. Metaskipper asks, what is the greatest pre-event and post-event meal you ever had? Some years ago at Grand Prix Dallas, I went out to dinner with the group of local Magic players that I traveled to the event for, and we had deep dish pizza, which is the first time I'd ever eaten that. Mike McCoy 7932 asks, what are your personal favorite decks to pilot competitively? The decks that I like to play tend to have at least some of the following criteria. They're powerful, resilient, and at least somewhat consistent. There's a lot of decision making, and the decisions are important. They heavily affect the outcome of the match, and if I play well, I do a lot better than if I play poorly. And the deck has the ability to make a comeback, meaning it can return from a losing position. Further, it's important for the deck to play out differently each time you play it. So this can mean that there's multiple different routes to winning, or that there's only one route to winning, but there's multiple ways to get there. Cry Havoc 21 asks, if you couldn't play MTG anymore, what TCG or other game would you play? I haven't played it, but I've heard good things about Flesh and Blood, so I'd probably try that out. Cry Havoc also asks, do you have any thoughts on the Commander-fication of new set releases and products? I understand why it's happening since Commander is Magic's most popular format, and so Wizards wants to put Commander cards into every single set. And I think that's fine actually, as long as it doesn't interfere with competitive one-on-one formats. For example, Hogak, Omnath, and True Name Nemesis are just some examples of cards that were originally designed to be commander cards, but then wound up screwing up 1v1 formats. So if Wizards is going to be putting commander cards into sets, they need to make sure that those cards are for commander and not for 1 versus 1. And even those 3 are just some of them. There's tons of other examples like Hull Breacher, Opposition Agent, etc. Cry Havoc also asks, what would be your suggestions to Wotc to re-engage with their competitive player base, maybe from business side, card design, public relations, competitive events, etc.? Well, I think they need to improve play patterns for one thing, a lot of which I covered in my bad card designs in its companion video. If cards become a problem in a format, they need to actually ban them really quickly and not wait around. Leaving cards like Hogak and Oko to just sit around and ruin the format for months is not acceptable. They need to go quickly. I understand that you don't want to ban things immediately. You want to give it about a week, 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks for the format to settle, see if players can adapt, sideboard, etc. But eventually a card becomes a problem and it needs to go. Another problem they have is with organized play, where they're constantly changing things and nobody understands what events you need to go to advance. Pick a lane, something simple, something that people understand and can follow along, and then stick with that. They need to bring back event coverage, as coverage for things like Grand Prix is actually very important. And finally, and probably most importantly, they need to substantially increase the prize payouts of their tournaments. Other esports can do it too, and if it means taking on sponsorships, that's fine. Wizards is also just disastrously bad at anything PR related. I don't really know how to fix it other than a complete top to bottom restructuring of their corporate philosophy, since they're pretty good at rivaling companies like EA for how bad they are. Ryan Studham 640 asks, at what subscriber number will you submit a burn deck list to a tournament? I've actually played burn lists multiple times before at competitive events. If you mean in front of my audience on stream, then sure, I can do that. They Call Him Pogo asks, do you pay the one for Rhystic Study? Always pay the one for Rhystic Study. The only exception is if you think you can win on the same turn. GPGP9198 asks, are you aware of community-driven formats such as old school or pre-modern? Any thoughts? I am aware of those formats and other formats like Oathbreaker and whatnot. I think if you enjoy those formats and you have a community that plays them, that's great. The problem is that they're pretty niche. So even if you're interested in them, you might not have anyone to play with. In general, I think it's difficult for niche formats like that to go mainstream, since EDH eats up most of the casual player base, and any format that isn't supported by Wizards has a difficult time breaking into competitive 1v1. Shadowblade BV1CM asks, do you play any other games that are not Magic related? If by that you mean regularly, as in a game that's based on a subscription or continuous pay service, then no. But if you mean any games at all, then sure. Every single piece of media that I consume that I think is good and probably worth rewatching or replaying or rereading, I catalog. If you're interested, you can use this link in the description to see my complete list, which includes any games. William T. Bear asks, are you a Rudy patron, and do you collect sealed product? No and no. Hadra Davis asks, what is your favorite flavor of ice cream? Cookies and cream. Xbox Gamer 474246 asks, what is the worst card you have ever had to play because nothing else was available or you just really needed it? Hard mode, no limited. Lantern of Insight. Andrew Thomas 5495 asks, if you were going to make a modern deck that was fun to play with and fun to play against, what would it be? I don't know, probably Boomer Jund, but if you're talking about decks that are currently viable, then I'm not sure. Ramon Struck Botanus 7700 asks, what music taste do you have? Favorite genre / artists? I have a pretty eclectic music taste, though I do tend to favor some genres over others. For example, I've recently been more interested in city pop. In terms of the artists that I have the most songs by, that would be David Bergode, who did the Ratchet & Clank soundtracks, and Daisuke Ishiwatari, who did all of music for Guilty Gear. Although just because I have the most songs by them doesn't necessarily mean that I like them the most. Among the other artists, I have a lot that I could say, but I think some of them that I can highlight are Bonus Points, Flamingosus, Ginseng, Coda Sound aka Junhee Lee aka Led Zeeper, who did most of the Maple Story music, Pegboard Nerds, and The Seatbelts, which is Yoko Kanno's band who did the music for the Cowboy Bebop soundtrack. I'd also like to make a special note for Noirette Blanc V, which is the artist that I use the most for my YouTube videos, since he has a lot of music on the YouTube audio library. In terms of specific songs, I wouldn't necessarily say that I have a favorite song, but I would say Today I'm feeling like my top 20 would include Anamoe by Taku Iwasaki from the Irregular at Magic High School soundtrack, Bloody Stream by Coda from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Brandy by Looking Glass, Crying for Rain by Minami, which is the OP for the Domestic Girlfriend anime adaptation, Don't Stop Me Now by Queen, Don't Stop the Sax by LTJ Sound Machine and James Thompson, Etude Opus 10 No. 3, aka The Tristesse by Chopin, which was rearranged for the Fullmetal Alchemist 03 soundtrack, Home by Medicine, I Wanna Be a Boy by Noriko Sakai, Iced Macchiato by Bonus Points and I Am Alex, Jessica by the Allman Brothers Band, Quickie by Mount Bird, Lotus Lane by The Loyalist, New Serena by Yuichi Kanatani from Yakuza 4, O Tengo Suerte by Masayoshi Takanaka, Shadow World by Shoji Meguro from Persona 4 Golden, Stories to Tell by Sunio Imahori from Trigun, Tank by The Seatbelt, which is the opening for Cowboy Bebop, We Are One by Pegboard Nerds and Split Breed, and Times 3 Shine by Kyo from Yakuza 0. And if you're interested in more of my music taste, I've made a link to the complete list of all of the songs from my music library. Sam Goring951 asks, do you think the direct-to-modern sets, Horizons, Lord of the Rings, have had a positive or negative impact on Modern and other Eternal formats as a whole? I think they're a mixed bag. The positives are that they have a lot of brewing potential and interesting card designs. They also have injected some otherwise unplayable archetypes into the format. For example, Modern Horizons 2 introduced Enchantress and Reanimator into Modern where they really didn't exist before. They also improved other archetypes that may have been lacking, such as Merfolk. But on the downside, they've also introduced a lot of overpowered, annoying, frustrating card designs, as well as put a huge financial burden on the format by introducing a bunch of must-play 4-ofs, especially at Mythic Rare, like the Evoke Elementals and Ragavan, just to name a few. I would say overall I'm not a fan, at least the way they're designing them now. Alex Zatukni2742 asks, would you be interested in introducing MTG gameplay to your channel? If by MTG gameplay you mean Moto, then yes. In fact, I'm planning on doing a marathon stream. Mortpadorp asks, would you ever remake any past videos, say the top 10 modern decks plus matchups one, since creativity and scams matchup spreads aren't covered on it? So something I try to do with my videos is that I want them to be timeless as much as they can be. I understand that new sets get printed, new cards become staples, decks change, metagames shift, and so on, but I want the videos to remain relevant for as long as possible. Those top 10 and top 12 plus sideboarding videos take an extremely long time to make and they get obsoleted very quickly. For example, at the time I made the modern one, creativity and scam were kind of around but hadn't really broken in yet. Whereas within a week or two after that video got posted, creativity and scam suddenly became tier 1 staple decks and suddenly the video was obsolete, at least somewhat. So essentially it depends on two factors mainly. How long would it take to remake and what's the audience interest? Mortpadorp also asks, how long does it take you to make a video from conceptualizing the idea to publishing it on YouTube? It depends on a lot of factors, how familiar I am with the concept, how much research I need to do, how many assets I need to acquire. So as far as the Guide to Every Deck series, I've gotten pretty damn good at pumping them out really fast. So for the average one, that's maybe 3 to 4 minutes long. From start to finish, from writing the script to the time that I publish it on YouTube, I can get it done in 4 hours. But that's best case scenario, assuming I'm completely familiar with the deck, I don't need to get any additional assets, and there's nothing particularly different or that I need to learn about it. Other videos take a lot longer. For example, the top 10 and top 12 plus sideboard videos took at least a week to make. The Amulet Titan video took a day to make. Basically, the longer it is, the more things that I have to do as far as editing, Photoshop work, etc. can take longer. And just as an example, this video took this long to make. Michno7712, along with many other people, asked, why do you pronounce mana wrong?
Mana. Mana. Mana.
Vladislav2471 asks, favorite dual color combination in Magic? Blue and green. Xbox Gamer 474246 asks another question, why do answers rarely get banned? Looking over the Modern and Pioneer ban list reveals very few bans for answer cards, even though there's quite a few worth considering. I know there are many answers R&D will never print into Modern, Force of Will being a big one, but once there, they rarely seem to get removed. Why is that? I think answer cards are inherently less problematic than threats because no matter how good an answer is, it can't win you the game. Put another way, answers are reactive whereas threats are proactive. So a card like Swords to Plowshares or Force of Will, no matter how good of answers they are, is simply not going to measure up to the best threats like Oko. Although obviously we've seen with cards like Veil of Summer, for example, that an answer can be too good. Xbox Gamer also asks, what if Fury is hurting Modern by suppressing too many creature decks? Merfolk, elves, goblins, humans, many potential tribal decks are trashed by incredibly efficient removal. There are no cards on the Modern ban list for being too good at answering the board. Is that a healthy balancing decision? What would a format look like if an answer was too good? I think Fury's effect on creature decks and specifically tribal decks has been overstated. Those decks were already not doing too well even before Fury. I think a bigger problem with those decks is they're just simply not as good as the other things you can be doing in the format, although I do think that Goblins and Merfolk are an exception. I do think that those two decks in specific are good enough to compete. Antcrafter1140 asks, why don't you cover Vintage or Standard? I mostly play Explorer on Arena, so the Pioneer videos are most relevant, but it is still interesting to learn about other formats and Magic design in general as it relates to older formats. Standard has a number of problems going for it. Rotation aside, it also constantly changes with new sets being printed and the metagame shifting frequently, meaning that content for Standard becomes obsolete incredibly quickly. I also just tend not to find it fun nor worth investing in. As for Vintage, it's far more of a niche format and is incredibly expensive to play offline. I don't know how it actually plays since I haven't played Vintage myself, so maybe it's great, but to me, I'm just not interested. Rex Verminus asks, favorite deck from each format? Well, in Modern, it used to be Lantern, but that deck has fallen off to the point where I don't think it's competitively viable anymore. So currently, I'd say Elementals, but I also really like Heliod Company and Urza Thopter Sword, as well as Timeless Amulet. In Legacy, it's any of the 3 or 4 color control decks. EDH is Kenrith the Returned King, and Pioneer none of them, although I play Green Devotion, so count that if you want. God of Fours 4064 asks, what is the video you've enjoyed making most? The April Fool's video. Tedio Valver de Molina 9719 asks, what are your thoughts on product fatigue? What would be an ideal set block expansion structure for you? I think the frequency of product releases, especially those where the cards are necessary for competitive 1v1 play, has gotten completely out of hand, both for players and stores. And while I don't think that Wizards has to release only on the old schedule of 4 sets a year and can include supplemental products, their current pace of releases is just completely absurd. Spearman9 asks, I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on the Pioneer format and how you would fix it, possible bannings, unbannings, a potential Pioneer Masters, reprints, etc. I think Pioneer has a big problem in terms of its answers being far too weak, although there are a few exceptions, but in general they're pretty bad, especially relative to the power level of the threats in the format. In terms of a potential Pioneer Masters, if it's a Masters set in terms of just reprints, which would cause the price to go down on singles, then fine, I'm all for that. But if you mean Masters in terms of introducing new cards in the same way that a Horizon set would, for example, then I'm against it. Connor Coolroutes 5228 asks, are you gay or otherwise LGBT? No, but it depends also on how you define it. For example, I wouldn't say that I'm 100% straight. Fernando B2275 asks, if you riffle shuffle a deck of 20 Black Lotus and 20 Fireball and nobody is around to hear it, did the deck get shuffled? You know, that reminds me of a story I heard of a player bringing their alpha and beta dual lands worth thousands of dollars to a tournament and having their opponent riffle shuffle the deck and then trying to sue them for damage afterwards. Magic cards can either be game pieces that'll be handled by other players, or they can be financially speculative collector items that'll be worth money, but not both. A Lost Rabbit says, artifacts have been a major focus for many sets. Kaladesh, Mirrodin, New Phyrexia, Brothers War, and have received a lot of support. Equipment, Affinity, Cheerios, certain +1 counter strats, etc, etc. Whereas enchantments have arguably had the short end of the stick, with Theros being the primary plane and sets to give them as much attention, with Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, Innistrad Crimson Vow, and Modern Horizons 2 offering some additional support. What are your thoughts on Wotc making the archetype more viable for competitive play? Do you think it's too unhealthy or unfavorable for the game with its emphasis on stacks prison pieces, locking out players, and the limited interactions for some colors? I think that the best dynamic in the game is creatures and removal for creatures, and when you start diluting it with other types of permanents, you run the risk of having games that rely on sideboarding more than anything else. That's where you get cards like Rest in Peace and Stony Silence that just devolve into games of, did you draw your silver bullet answer, and did the opponent draw their answer to that answer? And in fact, it's caused this situation where artifacts are so ubiquitous that artifact hate has become extremely powerful, to the point where oftentimes artifacts are a liability. So in general, I think where enchantments are currently positioned is perfectly fine. A Lost Rabbit also says, as a more general follow-up question, what archetypes or specific build-around cards do you think are underrated and deserve some more support? This could be for competitive formats in terms of power, or for more casual formats in terms of fun interactions. Well, this is what I wanted the Modern Horizons sets to be. Rather than super powerful chase cards that are worth a ton of money, more so introducing new archetypes that didn't exist before or boosting up archetypes that weren't doing so well. So for example, Modern Horizons 2 boosted the power level of Merfolk and introduced Enchantress and Reanimator as viable archetypes for the format. Soul Sisters, I would say, is another archetype that is some players' favorite, but which doesn't have the legs to go toe-to-toe with the other decks in the format. And for me personally, since I love Lantern, I would hope that that deck can make a comeback. Nintendo Master Number 1 asks, have you played any other card games, and if yes, what is your opinion of them? I used to play Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh, but that was so long ago that I don't really have a feel for those games anymore, and of course they've changed a lot. By a long time ago, I mean 20 years. My general impression of them from the outside looking in is that they're not nearly as good, and that a lot of the gameplay devolves into sort of every deck being Storm in a sense. As for other TCGs like Digimon, One Piece, Flesh and Blood, I haven't looked into them well enough. Girly Man asks, I enjoyed your old video about the end of Avatar: The Last Airbender. Do you think Avatar would have been stronger if it were a show made for adults, or did the creative restrictions work in its favor in your opinion? Who is your favorite character and why is it Zuko? Well, Girly Man, you have touched upon the correct fact that Zuko is in fact the best character. If the rest of you don't know what we're talking about, the reason the 2 is in the name Amio2 is because this is actually my second channel. I originally never intended to be an MTG exclusive content creator, and my other channel, Amio, reflects that. On that channel, I made a video analyzing the end of Avatar: The Last Airbender. So to return to your question, Girly Man, I think the creative restrictions did work against it in some ways, but as we all know, restrictions breed creativity. For example, somewhere where this wasn't the case was the old Gargoyles TV show. That show got canceled but was later picked up in the form of a comic book. And in the comic book, since it wasn't on the Disney Channel anymore, they included a lot more gore in it. And I think this worked directly against the spirit and atmosphere of the story. The Real Dalton Oates asks, are you planning to upload on your main channel more often or shifting your focus to just this channel? Love the videos, keep it up. Well, thank you very much, The Real Dalton Oates. There's at least 2 people that care about my original channel. While I would like to make content for that channel, unfortunately I can't really justify it. This channel is the one that's monetized, and it's this channel that the people have subscribed to me on Patreon for. Additionally, the kind of content that I would want to make for the original channel takes a lot more time to make, so I just can't justify investing all of the time into that rather than this. At least not for the moment. Amari Mars asks, what would you want in an MH3 set, assuming they don't just print extremely pushed chase cards? Well, as I've said with the other comments, I want them to support either archetypes that are currently somewhat good but just not quite there yet, or introduce new viable archetypes into formats. Interesting new build-arounds, interesting card designs, and not just high power level cards. But of course, when they inevitably do release Modern Horizons 3, I doubt that's going to be the case. It's probably just going to be super pushed, extremely expensive chase cards, like Ragavan, but colorless. Tree Derpa 6503 asks, if you could have one card reprinted in the next standard set, what would it be? Tropical Island. But no, seriously. Probably Path to Exile, so it would be Pioneer legal. Alternatively, just something that's really expensive to get the price down, like Shieldred the Apocalypse. The Estrail asks, can you make a cube that embodies your philosophy of fair and fun magic? Would love to play it with my family, or have a recommendation for a cube that is close to that. For anyone curious, here's a link to my Commander cube. Just to explain some things quickly, this is designed to be drafted in the same way Commander Legends was, so your deck has to adhere to color identity and thus all the legendary creatures of various colors. All of the non-legendary cards in the set are at least 2 colors or less and not 3 or more. There are no cards that say search on them in order to reduce loading screens. And there are no transform cards since this is designed to be proxied given how many expensive cards there are in here, and you don't want people taking slips of paper in and out of the sleeve. Jodacaster asks, what are your thoughts on the recent change to standard rotation and the change on ban philosophy for standard? I think that I, like many others, have completely lost interest in standard, and this is a misguided attempt to try to revitalize the format. I don't think these changes substantively improve the format, nor do I think they highly incentivize anyone who wasn't in Standard already to get into it. Additionally, Wizards keeps changing their mind all the time about basically everything, so I don't think this will even stick. Nona White 4277 asks, do you have any hobbies outside of Magic, and if so, which are your favorites? Yes, I do, but they're not safe for work. Stephen Poche 6988 asks, do you think the Pioneer precons are a reasonable way to get into the format, or do you think people should just skip them and save up for a real deck? Well, it entirely depends on what you're trying to do, but I think the big question is, are the singles in the precon the singles that you need for the deck, and could you get them cheaper buying them individually instead of in the precon? So let's take Lotus Field, for example. So here is the Pioneer Challenge deck for Lotus Field from 2021, and you can get it for approximately $50. Now, if you look at what's in the deck, you can see a comparison between the singles that are in the precon deck and the singles that are in actual Tier 1 Lotus Field. Here's a list of the cards that are in the competitive version of the deck that are not found in the precon that you would have to buy independently. And then here's a list of the cards that are in the precon that overlap in the competitive version of the deck and what they would cost if you bought them individually. So really, for any given one of these pre-constructed decks, it's just going to come down to, are the singles in the deck cheaper or at least on rate with how much it would cost to buy them individually? X20 Adam asks, what's your favorite card and why? Well, it used to be Deadeye Navigator in EDH, but unfortunately, it's really not even that good anymore. I also think Fact or Fiction is just an inherently interesting card that leads to interesting play patterns and a sort of pseudo-bluffing minigame with the opponent. But again, it's just not that good anymore. So nowadays, I would say it's Urza Lord High Artificer. It's powerful, but not too powerful. It's a great infinite mana outlet. I like what it does in giving you extra mana. And when it enters the battlefield, you do get some value out of it in creating a construct, but you don't get immediate value out of it in terms of drawing a card or removing something. And while it is good, you do need to build significantly around it. It's not a card like, say, Omnath that's just incredibly good on its own regardless. My one big issue with Urza, though, is that in EDH at least, it's so incredibly good with stacks cards like Winter Orb and Static Orb that you're basically just incorrect if you don't run those, and I don't like to play stacks decks in EDH. Control for Days asks, to piggyback off of your Every Deck series, what do you think the most underrated decks are in each format, and or what are your favorite decks past and present? Well, my favorite deck of all time is Lantern. I also really liked KCI before that got banned. In terms of underrated decks in each format, for Pioneer, I think Elves and the Sorin Galta deck are a lot better than what their play numbers represent. For Modern, it's Urza and Heliod. I think those are a lot better than people give them credit for. And in Legacy, and I'm not memeing here, I think Attractions is legitimately a good deck. Maybe not in the exact incarnation that we see it currently, but I think it could be good. Masterball7787 asks, what is your favorite Standard format of all time? My favorite period of Standard was between September 2012 and 2015, which was the sets Return to Ravnica block, Theros block, and Khans of Tarkir block. Witza Vanderveer 6351 asks, do you think Ponza in Modern is healthy for the format? Do you like Ponza, and could and should Ponza or a similar style of deck be playable in Pioneer? I don't think that any deck based around mana denial is good for any format. Now, does that mean that Ponza is too good? No, in fact, it's not even one of the top tier decks at the moment. But any deck whose entire strategy is Stone Rain or Blood Moon the opponent out of the game is, in my opinion, not fun. Norman H7920 asks, does it feel strange your second channel is more popular than your main one? Yes, but that's how the cookie crumbles. GPVS3 asks, what do you think should be done about cards that have degenerate designs but aren't worthy of being banned based on power level? At what point does a format just become defined by years of bad card design choices and it just isn't worth having a ban list that looks like Yu-Gi-Oh? And by a similar token, Crypto3K asks, your ideal format, or would you like to make a video about such a format, a sort of endpoint to all the videos discussing the bad mechanics / card / interactions? So ideally, Wizards would just be more careful when designing things and definitely stay away from their fire design philosophy. But regardless of what they do, eventually cards like Three Fairy or Fable the Mirror Breaker are going to slip through the cracks. Cards that are really good, but aren't necessarily Hogak or Oko levels of broken. And if you just ban every single card that's a little too good or is a little annoying to play against, you're going to have a ban list that's 200 cards long. And my fix to that is that every format would be Legacy. And I don't mean that every format would have exactly the same cards and decks as Legacy.
I mean that Legacy has a ton of Degenerate cards, things like Reanimator and Show and Tell decks and all sorts of combo decks that can win on turn 1, but the format is strangely fair. In fact, it feels more fair than any other format. And that's because Legacy has the best answers you can have, specifically Force of Will. Having really good, free, or super cheap answers means that no matter how degenerate the threats become, the answers can always answer them. And what you see with a lot of the bad play patterns in Pioneer and Modern, for example, is that you have a bunch of decks that have really good threats or synergies, and there aren't really good answers to them, or the answers don't line up well, the investment is too high for what you need to answer, and so on.
The Kitten Freakify says, "You talk too much."